Victor Mimma was 34 years old, but already he had the look of a man who believed the world owed him something. Born in the small settlement in the north of Namibia, raised partly in the sprawl of Freedomland in Katutura, he never warmed to the routine of school. Instead, he drifted into business with a restless determination that seemed almost reckless. To those who knew him, ambition gleamed in his eyes like petrol set on fire. It was never just about surviving. He wanted more. He wanted the whole stage. By the time he was 23, Malima had found his way into Namibia's fuel industry. At first glance, it seemed accidental. A young man with connections sliding into an arena dominated by older, more seasoned players. But the fuel business in Namibia has never been an ordinary trade. It is the lifeline of a country without oil refineries of its own, a nation that imports almost every drop of fuel it consumes through the port of Walvis Bay. Control the flow of that fuel, and you hold the veins of the economy in your hand. At the centre of this system sits Namcor, the state-owned petroleum corporation tasked with ensuring the nation's energy security. In theory, Namcor was meant to safeguard Namibia from shortages and volatility, to keep the lights on and the trucks moving. In practice, it became a revolving door of political appointments, weak oversight, and questionable decision-making. Contracts were often awarded on trust, with credit lines extended to private companies far beyond what due diligence should have allowed. Once you secured Namcor's approval, fuel worth millions could be moved on credit with little more than a signature, and repayment could be kicked down the road indefinitely. For an ambitious young man like Malima, this was not a barrier, but an opportunity. He had a family name that carried weight. His uncle, once a defense minister, and later a spy chief, was a man people either feared or admired, and that shadow cloaked him. Where others saw red tape, Malima saw a system that could be bent, a network that could be played. He stepped into the world of fuel not as a novice, but as someone who knew that doors would open if he knocked loudly enough. Victor's house in Onayena was his statement to the world. Built at a cost of about $2 million Namibian dollars, it stood like a fortress of ambition near the road that led to Oshikango. Inside its walls, Malima parked the symbols of his taste: a Jeep, a brand new BMW M2, and 2 Toyota Land Cruiser V8s. The house resembled a guest house, neighbours whispered, but it was no place for guests. It was a private shrine to success, and perhaps to something darker. Behind the gleam of his cars and the whispers of wealth, there was a story unravelling. By the year 2023, murmurs began circling about Enocon, a company tied to the Ilindi family, owing the National Petroleum Corporation of Namibia millions. Fingers pointed toward Malima, the young tycoon with the fast cars and faster deals. He had already been entangled in EcoFuel, his own company, which positioned itself as a disruptor in the fuel trade. But the line between EcoFuel and Enocon was blurred, and within that haze, billions of dollars in fuel transactions shifted hands, debts vanished and reappeared, and Namcor, the state-owned petroleum company, became a reservoir to be drained. It is said that crime often hides in plain sight, dressed as opportunity. EcoFuel secured contracts with Namibia Wildlife Resorts and with Enocon, which in turn supplied fuel to the Defence Force. The business model was simple: order on credit, distribute the fuel, pocket the money, and ignore the repayment. Records vanished. Logs were falsified. Trucks disappeared. The scheme was not crude smash-and-grab theft, but something far more elegant in its design. Tankers would roll out of Namcor depots under the cover of legitimacy, papers stamped, signatures scribbled, everything appearing in order. On delivery notes, it would say the cargo was bound for government ministries, state-owned companies, or fuel retailers. But many of those deliveries never happened. The trucks diverted, the fuel sold off privately, and the records doctored so that nothing seemed out of place. Inside the depots, the collusion ran deep. Employees manipulated gauges, erased logs, and sometimes issued duplicate slips for the same consignment. To an auditor, the paperwork appeared sound. To an insider, it was a skeleton with missing bones. Fuel worth millions of dollars moved out of state tanks and into private pockets, while Namcor's ledgers showed debts that seemed to multiply without explanation. By the time Namcor's books were reviewed, 380 million Namibian dollars had melted away, as if siphoned through invisible pipes. What the public saw was rising fuel prices, shortages, and a company staggering under unexplained debts. What investigators pieced together was a system where state resources were treated like personal credit cards, guarded by gatekeepers who had already sold their loyalty. Investigators would later trace how EcoFuel's $73 million debt was quietly absorbed into Enecon's accounts. On paper, it looked like nothing more than a tidy restructuring, the kind of adjustment that state-owned companies often approve to keep business partners afloat. In theory, debt absorption allows a stronger company to shoulder the liabilities of a weaker one, smoothing operations and protecting suppliers. In practice, it can become a magician's trick. Bad debts vanish from one set of books, only to reappear buried inside another, harder to trace and easier to forget. For Namcor, this meant a dangerous precedent. Instead of insisting on repayment, the company allowed debts to be shifted like pawns on a chessboard. The result was that EcoFuel's obligations dissolved into Enecon's larger balance sheets, effectively socializing the losses while privatizing the gains. Taxpayers, not executives, were left to bear the weight. To the untrained eye, it looked like business as usual. To the Anti-Corruption Commission, it was the anatomy of a racket disguised as an accounting decision. This was corruption of a different breed. It was not the brazen theft of tankers in the night, but the quiet manipulation of numbers, the kind of fraud carried out in boardrooms instead of back alleys. Globally, scandals like this have bled billions from public coffers, whether through banks shifting toxic loans onto governments or state companies absorbing strategic partners' losses. Victor's name floated at the center, sometimes as a chief executive, sometimes as an associate, always close enough to the cash flow to benefit, but never standing still long enough to be pinned down. The scandal grew teeth. Malima's brother was arrested for allegedly stealing fuel from Namcor's Walvis Bay depot in 2024. That year, 69 trucks loaded with state-owned fuel reportedly failed to deliver their cargo. The loss was valued at $49 million. A nephew of the Namcor boss himself, Denzel Malunga, was implicated. Even Malima's cousin, a plumber named Leo Stephanus, was arrested. What looked like a corporate misstep began to smell like a family business, a network of relatives threading their way through Namibia's fuel empire. Whispers spread that Malima had fled across the border into Angola. He denied wrongdoing, speaking coolly to reporters, insisting EcoFuel had not traded with Namcor for over 16 months. But denial is not proof, and fugitives rarely have the luxury of convincing explanations. His own allies admitted he was preparing to hand himself over. The Anti-Corruption Commission's director, Paulus Noah, dismissed talk of rewards for information. The public must just give information, he said. If they are committed to fighting corruption, why should they be rewarded? The path that led to this scandal was written years earlier, when a 16-year-old Malima moved into the home of Peter Elindi, a man already neck-deep in the fuel trade. The Elindi brothers, Peter and Malakia, had launched Enecon in 2007 with the backing of August 26, the Defense Ministry's company. Malima grew up alongside their children. To him, fuel was not just a commodity, it was inheritance, a ticket to status, a means of bending rules until they broke. Growing up under the roof of the Elindi brothers, men who had already carved out their share of the fuel empire, Victor could not have failed to see ambition dressed as destiny. For someone like him, success was not a question of if, but when. And when ambition becomes expectation, shortcuts can begin to feel like rights. Researchers have long noted this moral drift. A study by Harvard Business School professor Max Bazerman, in his work on bounded ethicality, shows how individuals justify unethical actions when those actions benefit their group or secure their future. In such cases, people do not see themselves as thieves. They see themselves as providers, visionaries, or men correcting an unfair system stacked against them. For Malima, siphoning state credit into his own ventures might not have felt like corruption. It may have felt like claiming what was owed, taking the inheritance of power he believed was his. The psychology of corruption is often less about desperation than about entitlement. Transparency International has written extensively about how networks of kinship and patronage in Africa blur the line between family loyalty and public duty. When family is everything, as it was in the Alindi Malima circle, corruption can be framed not as betrayal of the state, but as devotion to one's bloodline. Fuel, in this light, was not just oil in a tank. It was proof of legacy, a resource to be passed on, a stage on which to prove his worth. Unchecked ambition twists reality. The psychologist Albert Bandura, in his research on moral disengagement, explains how people convince themselves that harmful acts are acceptable by reframing them as serving a greater cause. Victor spoke of ploughing back into the youth, of building opportunity for young black men and women. That narrative was not just for public consumption. It may have been the very story he told himself as the debts ballooned, as the trucks rolled out of depots under false pretenses. In that sense, his fall is not simply about greed. It is about the stories people tell to live with their choices. Ambition, inheritance, pride, these are not abstract forces. They are the fuel that drives men like Malima to cross the line, and then to convince themselves the line was never really there. He was not the kind of man to blend into the shadows. He opened a wedding decor boutique at Ondangwa. He surrounded himself with cars, houses, and the suggestion of endless money. But there was also a silence around him, cultivated with care. He avoided social media. He gave little of himself away, leaving others to build his story from fragments. To some, he was a rising mogul. To others, a predator cloaked in suits and family ties. Fuel fraud is not unique to Namibia. Across the world, petroleum is one of the most stolen commodities on the planet. From Nigeria's Niger Delta to Mexico's Pemex pipelines, syndicates have turned oil into black gold for the underworld. The United Nations once estimated that fuel theft drains tens of billions of dollars annually from economies, money that could have built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. The methods are chillingly familiar. Fake invoices, phantom deliveries, insiders at depots, and tankers that never arrive at their destination. In every country where oversight is weak and temptation strong, the pattern repeats itself. Namcor's $380 million hole is part of this wider story. What happened in Walvis Bay or Ondangwa echoes scams in far larger markets, proving that fuel theft thrives not because of poverty alone, but because of greed married to opportunity. When oversight collapses and ambition blinds men to consequence, the state itself becomes a bank whose vaults are never locked. Today, Victor is a fugitive. A man who once promised to plough back to the youth now stands accused of plundering the nation's coffers. He is the son of a soldier, the nephew of a minister, the foster son of fuel barons, and the architect of companies that drained the lifeblood of Namcor. Somewhere, across the border, or perhaps still hidden within Namibia, he watches the walls close in. The story of Victor Malima is not finished. It is a story of ambition without anchor, of family legacies turned poisonous, of a national company reduced to a feeding trough. It is also a reminder that corruption is never faceless. It has homes with gates, cars with tinted windows, and names that everyone knows, but no one dares to say too loudly.
that's the story so far. But what do you think about the Namcor saga? Was this just another case of greed spiraling out of control? Or is there more to the story than meets the eye? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more deep dives into Namibia and South Africa's biggest corruption scandals, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload.